learning over these 8 days that are yet to be undertaken. So I want to be very analytical today. I want to spend a little time with you and dig deeper. I want to deconstruct the topic. That's my aim. Remember, I said the last time I was here, the first speaker spoke about the process. And in speaking about the process, he combined his theological knowledge and background with his professional training, embedding a lot of chemistry and physics so that we can understand what the purification concept means and how each of us have a different tolerance level or different schema within that whole broad subject. My goal today is to deconstruct the topic a little and maybe pay attention to some things that I know that I would gloss over if it is not brought to my attention. I'd like to begin by making reference to an article that I read recently, which talks about the Greek and Hebrew view of man. Now, in a different audience, at a different time, for a different purpose, I would approach this article in a different way. But for today's purpose, I will just pull a couple of things from this article, and then I'm going to launch into the scriptures. It's about the concept of dualism. D-U-A-L-I-S-M, dualism. And there are different views for thousands of years about this concept. One view is that, which is a view that is advanced by a Greek philosopher that existed some time ago by the name of Plato. His view is that dualism refers to mind and body. And what Plato sought to do was to distinguish between mind and body. And in Plato's view, the mind is one entity by itself, and that our bodies is another entity by itself. And that's why he calls it dualism. So it's dual. We are in a dual zone, so to speak. Moving further, Plato sees dualism as two worlds. One world is the visible world that we're familiar with now. Bear with me. I'm going somewhere with this, all right? One world is, the visible world is the world in which we live. The world that we occupy. The world in which we were born. And the world from which we shall depart when we die. The other world that Plato saw was the spiritual world, believe it or not. Plato spoke about that. Not from a religious point of view, but from a philosophical point of view. He got the understanding that there is the material world in which we live and there is the spiritual world. And he went on to say that man stands between both worlds. And he's related to both worlds. Plato sees the origin of our soul as that of the invisible world. In his eyes, our soul does not belong to the physical world. But our soul eventually came into the physical world. I'm cutting out a lot of the details because this is not a lecture on philosophy. Plato went on to say that salvation is the freeing of the soul from its entanglement in the physical world. And it makes its way back. The soul, when we die, wing its way back to the heavenly world or the spiritual world. He uses a term that he called ipso facto, which refers to sin, the source of evil. And that redemption is accomplished by a heavenly, not the, but in his eyes, a heavenly Redeemer who descends to the earth to deliver the fallen souls and lead them back to heaven. This article of which I'm referencing then speaks about the biblical dualism. It speaks about biblical dualism. And it speaks about it in a religious and ethical sense. It says, and I quote, "The world is God's world. Man is God's creature. Although we're rebellious and sinful and have fallen." So in spite of our disposition, in spite of our sinfulness, in spite of the fact that we have sinned and have fallen, we are still God's. That's what this writer is saying. He then goes on to say that salvation, which is now going to have me segue into 1 Peter chapter 1, salvation is achieved not by a flight from the world, but by God's coming to man in his earthly historical experience. According to this source, salvation never means flight from the world to God. It means, in effect, God's descent from heaven to bring man in the historical experience into fellowship with himself. I know that can be very thick and dense, so I'm not going to stay much longer with that. My point in reading that excerpt is to let us know that thousands of years ago, before even Peter came on the scene, mankind was very concerned about his soul. Even before Christ. If you look at philosophy, as I just did, very small chunk of it, you can see that man has always been grappling with the notion of what happens to him when he dies. And even before Christ came, the belief was, in some aspect of Platoism and his theory of dualism, is that when man dies, his soul goes somewhere in the spiritual world. He talks about the physical world in which we live now, but that when we die, our soul goes to that spiritual world. He didn't call it heaven. He didn't know about Jesus, so he didn't write about Jesus playing any part in that. He does not identify our God as the God who saves us and makes us. Am I making sense? So there was this view out there about the infinite nature of the soul, the indestructible nature of the soul, and the destructible, finite nature of matter and the world in which we live, the physical world. Nothing was said about how you get to the physical world, the spiritual world from the physical world. Nothing is said about that, except that you live a good life. And from that, all kinds of other views emerged. like the view of reincarnation, which speaks about, you'll come back. Maybe you'll come back as a butterfly if you live a good life, or a hummingbird, or you may come back as a cat. When Jesus came, he put all of that speculation in perspective. When Jesus came, he framed the whole concept relative to the existence of man and gave meaning to our existence. In 3.5 years, he revolutionized the way that mankind will forever look at himself vis-a-vis the world in which he lives. What Peter sought to do in chapter 1 of the first book of Peter is to repackage his knowledge coupled with his experience of having witnessed the transformative nature of Christ's ministry. This is this humble speaker's perspective. My perspective today is we ought to see Peter as a schoolmaster who gathers his students, extrapolate from some textbooks, which in Peter's case, life experiences for having walked with Christ as a disciple, seen Christ done miraculous soul-transforming things. And don't forget, he was one of the first persons who experienced the consequences of Jesus' resurrection. So if we are to find someone, or if we were to point to someone who will authenticate the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, then one of the persons that we have to naturally think about is Peter. Because he was one of the first disciples that made it his point of duty to purposefully investigate the fact of the resurrection. Purposefully. He deliberately did it. He even, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not citing any reference now, speaking from memory, I think he went in the tomb, from what I believe, from what I understand. There is a research terminology that I'm going to use. He investigated the fact, which means when you have investigated the fact, not as a detective does, but he actually said to himself, no, I'm not going to rely on what the angels say who are guarding the tomb. I am not going to rely on these women's account of the event that morning. I am going to investigate it myself. And there's a word for that, there's a term for that in research that I'm not going into today because it's not necessary. So I want to spend a little more time with you talking about Peter. Because here's why. Any good book that you read, any good novel that you read, any good play that you read, in order for you to appreciate the construct of that play or novel, you got to learn about the writer. Hello? You know, the British government is making a lot of money every year off Shakespeare. Tourists from all over the world go up to Stratford-upon-Avon and they go to, I've gone there twice, to Shakespeare's birthplace. Gone into the house where he was born, seen the bed that he supposedly slept on, seen the house, and they recreated the way it was during his time. And why do people do that? People do that so that when they read his plays, they can see why he wrote the way he wrote. If I were to write a book and become a scholar, that in that sense, I would hope that you would go to Harry Watch and see the house that I grew up in. So you can understand why I think the way I Peter writes the way he writes and why he emphasizes the things he emphasizes is to look at whom he is as a man. My first introduction to Peter is that he was a fisherman. Simply put, fisherman. I don't know if you've ever gone by the beach and seen a fisherman. That does not make him less of a good citizen, by the way. It's just his job. That's it. And that gets down to business. If you're a fisherman, you don't have no time to skylark. We're not qualifying him. We're not putting him on any social stratification. We're just saying it's a life and death matter. You cut through all the chase and you get to the main point. You sink your net, you pull it up, and hopefully it's heavy when it's coming back up. That's it. And if you notice his temperament, it's very much like his former profession. But there's something about Peter that is very fascinating to me. And that is his candor and his forthrightness. You may be asking, why is Brother Wolfe going into all that? Well, the point is simple. If I'm going to accept what Peter says is true, remember now, I believe, and let me hasten to qualify this, I believe that irrespective of who said it. Are you with me now? All right, so there's no in the Bible. Everything, without exception, is the anointed Word of God. Ambiguity about my belief. But I also happen to know that there have been translations done to the original Bible. There have been translations done to the Word. It has gone through different translations and penmanship, and there are likely to be errors with respect to accuracy. And so, in my desire to fully rationalize and accept Peter's view, as we're going to look at it a little closer in a minute, I have to study the guy. If you are dealing with a salesman who is selling you a car, and you happen to know, let's say you go to buy a used car, and you know that the salesman is a liar, he is deceptious, he's unreliable, would you still buy a car from him? I don't think so. I think you would want to ask for another representative, right? So we should not assume that it is wrong for us to take a moment to look at who Peter is so that we can validate what he's saying to us. That's all I'm doing. Peter was a man of sound character to the point where the Lord said to him, "Thou art Peter?" Huh? And what else? "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against you." I don't think Christ's pronunciation that we just quoted is different from what I'm doing today. In order for Christ to have said, "Of Peter, Peter, thou art Peter, you are the rock, and I'm going to build my church with your faith," that had to have been preceded by an examination of this man's character, an examination of this man's faith, an examination of this man's we look at this topic and hear Peter say that the trial of your faith, more precious than gold, can you rely on that? Talk back to me now. Imagine you're in class with me, okay? So I don't mind if you raise your hand and ask a question. I don't want to be didactic. I want to be interactive. So stop me, question me, challenge me. I'm accustomed to it. I do this for a living. So Peter, I believe you can rest assured that what Peter is saying is reliable because of his character. Am I making sense? Yes. And the great assessor of man's soul and character has qualified him, has qualified Peter as an eligible spokesman for him. Am I making sense now? Jesus himself qualifies Peter and says to Peter, you are my ambassador. You can represent me abroad. When I'm gone, you can talk for me, Peter. I have no problem with you speaking on my behalf. And whatever you say, I will endorse it because I know your faith. Your faith is the rock on which my church is built. Making sense? So once I knew that, see, I'm the kind of learner that has to understand these things before I can assimilate the learning. Peter now says, I, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, qualifying his office and himself. It's not Collin, Wolfe speaking. It's not John Doe speaking. Peter, whom God knows to be the man that I am. I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ. And he's addressing this to strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So there is a targeted audience that he seems to have had in mind when he wrote this epistle. I'm sure by inference we could conclude that he was meant to write this to the benefit of all Christians, including us who live in the 21st century. But I beg to differ to anybody who says that that's the only reason for which he wrote. I believe, and I'm the first to tell you, that I'm not a scholar of the Bible. I'm not. I'm just like my father, not trained in any divinity or theological thing. God bless those who are. So you have to bear with me. I'm using poetic license to interpret the scripture as best as I can as a layman of the scripture. And I'm saying under those constructs that Peter had a targeted audience that he named. And that leads me to ask the question, whom was he addressing? For whom was his thoughts directed primarily? So you can have your primary audience, which he has defined the geographical boundaries of his audience. But in terms of the recipient of his message, for whom was it meant? It is my humble opinion, and if anybody thinks I'm wrong, I pray that you will hastily correct me. It is my belief that Peter, based on what I have read and what I've heard over the years, that his primary audience, his targeted audience, and I'm using the word primary because you can have your primary audience, you can have a secondary audience, and you can have a tertiary audience. I believe that we are part of the tertiary audience. The primary audience to whom he addressed his message were the Jews, I believe, that through the foreknowledge of God, So Peter had a targeted audience, and the targeted audience were those Jews. There are, you know, when you read someone's writing, it's important that we look at the vocabulary, the choice of words, the syntactic trend of the writer. One of the words that popped out to me and phrases is the word inheritance. Inheritance. Let's look at it in the scriptures. Inheritance. Verse 4. To an inheritance incorruptible. We're going to get to that in a minute. But he was playing, in my estimation, remember now, I'm only sharing with you my perspective on the topic. He was playing on that notion held primarily by the Jews. That issue of that concept of inheritance. Jews are very big on that. And that is why they teach their little children everything they need to know about their history. That word, inheritance, is of tremendous interest to me, and I could spend more time on that, but I won't today. What is that inheritance? What is it? I'm asking rhetorically. You know, when I think of inheritance, I think of what my father left for me. And he did. I have to probate on certain things here and there and claim certain things legally and make sure it is transferred to my name and this and that. But when Peter spoke of that inheritance, it is my belief that he was not speaking about something physical that was bequeathed to them. He's speaking about something rather spiritual, don't you think? Divine inheritance. Spiritual, not. Can you begin to see the relevance of what I read earlier when I started? The whole concept of dualism, the physical world, the spiritual world. All right. Another word that I find of interest is the word elect. The word elect. When I am elected, what does that mean? Chosen. I'm chosen by a process, by a legitimate process. Nobody can question the outcome. You know, there's a big, if I may digress a bit, there's a big debate going on in the country right now about the Russians having allegedly interfered with the American election, when was it, last year? The subliminal message in that whole debate is that, I'm not going to get political, I'm going to keep it literary, is that the present president is not legitimate. That's what the subliminal message is. If you tell me that some other country interfered with my election and I got elected, what you're really saying to me is, had that country not interfered, maybe I would not have gotten elected. Are you with me now? But nobody can say that about our salvation. Nobody can say that any foreign power used social media or whatever technological or scientific device is available to man to interfere with our salvation. We were elected by God. And Peter, if you look at Peter, he was not, from the best of my knowledge and understanding, he was not a trained legal scholar. But his approach is very similar to an experienced, well-matured lawyer who in his opening statements, he uses certain terminologies, makes certain references, asks certain rhetorical questions to frame the thinking of the jury. Are you with me now? So when he uses words like, you're elected, words like inheritance, and so on, These are subliminal messages that is being sent to the people for whom he's writing, so that when he frames his argument in the end, we can fully see the picture rather clearly. I like what he says. The elect referred to in verse 1 are being kept by the power through faith unto salvation. Kept unto salvation. Very interesting phrase. To be revealed in the last time. The word salvation, from my humble point of view, also has a double meaning. When you think of his primary targeted audience, I think the word salvation has one meaning, which is that I use the word in a little paper I wrote, I use the word emigre as emigrant as opposed to immigrant. You know, there's a difference. An emigrant is not the same as an immigrant. So he was writing to experiences in living in other places was not as palatable as it would people who either were forced or they were voluntarily scattered abroad. Would have been in their own homeland. Making sense? And in the back of their minds, they were hoping for and longing for the Messiah who would give them salvation, save them from those political and social and economic hardships that they were experiencing as aliens and foreigners in these places mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 1. But there's another more powerful and enduring meaning of the term salvation, and I would remiss if I hadn't mentioned it. And it is the salvation of their soul. And I put it to you that even if Peter's original intent was to imply their political salvation. By the way, if you think that what I'm saying is unreliable, then explain to me then what Luke meant in Acts chapter 1 when the Lord ascended into heaven. And some of the folks that were watching that murmured and said, we thought that you were here to restore the kingdom of heaven. So there was a fraction of believers who thought that Jesus was the Messiah, and that indeed he is, but that they thought his purpose at that time was more political than spiritual. So Peter felt, his use of that word, I think, has a dualism about it. The dualism had to do with the socio-political implication of the term, but I think the emphasis is on the spiritual, because he's talking about their salvation, their inheritance, incorruptible, in heaven, awaiting them in heaven. So the emphasis is more on the spiritual than it is on the socio-political. I want to go through this chapter in a little more detail. One of the intents of Peter in his opening chapter, before he gets to verse 7, in my estimation, was also to affirm the authenticity of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. So if this were a book or a novel we were reading, we would now be on chapter 2. Chapter 1 says, I am Peter, authentic, no fake. Fake news? I'm not fake. I'm for real. I'm an apostle. And based on my faith, the Lord himself says he's going to build the church on my faith, on the basis of my proclamation of my faith. So I'm not fake news. I am for real. You're supposed to laugh. I won't tell you which party I belong to. but, but one thing I will tell you, blame Bishop Williams, okay? Because he told me what to do when I came here. And I said, yes, sir. All right. So Peter said, I'm for real. I'm for real. That's what chapter 1 is all about. You can trust what I'm about to say. I'm authentic. I'm real. There's no spin here, according to O'Reilly. No spin. You're getting the real stuff. So chapter 2 now, he turns away from himself, Bishop Brett. He turns from his target audience, and he's now saying, let me turn to the man who is the center of all our existence, Jesus Christ himself. So chapter 2, in that book that we're not reading, but in verse 3 of his epistle, let's read it together. You can read it slowly while I read it aloud. He said, blessed be God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to his abundant mercy. You know, I never knew how important that word abundant is until I spoke with a relative of mine who is in the legal field. And having heard a judge instructed the jury to exercise abundant caution in looking at the evidence. In other words, don't run to the gun. That's what verse 3 is all about. He's building his argument. And he's saying to them, according to, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to his abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto what? A lively hope. A lively hope. You see, here's what I'm learning about salvation as I get older. It's given to me, but all of it has not yet been materialized in my life. I hope I'm not ambiguous. I hope you're not thinking that I have not accepted it, salvation in its fullest. But the longer I live is the more I see of salvation. I don't know if I'm making sense. What I have come to experience and acknowledge and what I have received since the past several months about salvation, if I had died a year ago, I would not have gotten into such deep understanding. The longer I live, the more the concept and the act of salvation is revealed to me and is applied to my life. And the knowledge of it, and the scope of it, and the blessings of it. If I had died as a child, I would not have understood it. And the longer you serve him, the sweeter he grows. That sweetness is embedded in the knowledge that God has given us about the state of grace, which is incorruptible, undefiled, and faded not away. That's it. And you know, when the bishop spoke on Sunday, I wanted to get up and say yes, because he was touching the academic propensity in my life when he talked about the fact that certain elements, right, have to face, and I'm paraphrasing it, have to undergo different types of heat in order to reach impurity. So if you have a mixture, if you have that's a piece of iron and you melt it, within that iron there are certain substances and metals and other things that compose it that won't respond to purity at a lower temperature. Are you with me now? You have to keep turning up the heat. You got my point now. You got to keep turning up the heat to make other elements within that substance pure. Burn off the dross. Burn off the dross. Gotta get it. So everybody's fiery trial is not going to be the same. Sometimes, you know, you're saved for 30 years and you think, I know my fiery trial should be over. I'm vintage now. I'm in when you go into certain schools, the ill-performing teachers sit in what they call the teacher's room. And all they do is start by the principal, number one. And how they going to get him out? And number two, they talk about how long they have been teaching. Or some teachers. Now, I'm not making a comparison, but there are people in church, not this one, not this organization, but there are people in church who, when you come in the serve, when you as a new convert walk in, praise the Lord, sister, I'm brother so-and-so, I've been here for 45 years. Yes, sir. As a young Christian, you say, can I do that? We're talking about Steve Urkel and Sunday. Can I do that? Not did I do that, but can I do that? Can I really, as a young Christian, I'm thinking, with all the temptations that I just left in the world, can I survive the 45 years? I'm out of here. One day at a time. Lively hope. by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. I told you that my goal is to deconstruct the message. That's my goal. Deconstruct it. Rip it apart. And then reconstruct it. It's a form of thinking which we call analysis. Synthesis is when you put it back together. Peter touched on the resurrection. I wonder, why is he touching on the resurrection? What was the purpose? Because his target audience, the Jews, have split views about resurrection. Some group believe in resurrection apostles, some don't. I want to believe that those who comprise his targeted audience have to have believed in the resurrection because they believe in Christ, right? But he's reminding them, and I want to believe that if you really look at this scripture again, not holistically, but deconstruct it the way we're doing today, and certain terms and words will pop up, and stop and think about it. You know when you read a scripture, you see a little word that says "selah" or "selah"? It means stop and think about what you just read. So stop and think about it. Why would Peter, given the central theme of his message, why would he be talking about the resurrection? So it's a real question. Because I believe that there's some possibilities. One is that these Jews were now living at a place where most of the people don't believe in the resurrection. Different culture, different country. Why should I assume that those who are living in, that the citizens, the natural citizens of Cappadocia, Asia is a big part of the world, it's one of the continents, Bithynia, why should I assume that they all believed in the resurrection? There is a term in the discipline of anthropology and sociology which is called assimilation, where